So we know what a function looks like, but now we're going to take a break and build a function that calculates the sum of any numbers passed into it. So think about how this might work. We need a list of numbers that we want to add up, and then we want to return the result. So we already know how to build functions, and earlier when we looked at arithmetic, we know how to add numbers up. So if you take what we've learned, we might build something like this. So I'm going to create a function called add, and into this we might accept a list of numbers. So let's say num1, and we'll do the same for num2 and num3. And of course within here we can return the result of num1 plus num2 and then of course num3 as well, like so. Let's go ahead and call this, and then we'll talk about the problem with this. So let's go ahead and add up 5, 10 and 10, and we'll echo the result of that because obviously we are returning a value. Let's take a look in the browser, and of course we see 25 here. So this works, but it's not really that flexible. We're only allowing here for 3 numbers to be passed in, and if we wanted to add another argument, this could break our code later on. So for example, if we wanted to add another number, or at least accept another number, and then go ahead and add this on, we'd have to go through our code and update anywhere we'd use the add function, because of course it now requires 4 arguments, and now we are missing argument 4. So there's a couple of ways that we can get around this, and I'd like you to think of a way that you might be able to get around this using an array. Now we know that we can define out any number of options within an array, so we could say numbers, or at least any number of values. We could say the same thing, so 5, 10 and 10. And into this, rather than pass a list of numbers, we could pass an array in. So if you'd like, pause the video and try and create a more flexible solution. What we need to be able to do is pass in an unlimited amount of numbers into this function, loop through them and add them up. So I've already given you a clue, but have a go if you like. Otherwise, we'll look at this particular solution now, and then we'll go on to another easier solution. Okay, so the numbers that we have here then, we want to accept into this just here. So let's go ahead and get rid of the return value as well, and we'll also get rid of this. So into this, we now need to accept in an array. Now what we can actually do here is, rather than just say numbers, we can do something called type hinting. Now this involves placing before this the type you're expecting. And into a function at the moment, at least with versions in PHP lower than 7, you can't type hint any other data type. But now this function tells us that we must accept an array in. Let's just try and call this, and we'll see what happens if we don't pass an array in. So let's echo out the result of add, and then we're going to go ahead and pass in, say, 5 in there. So just a single value. Let's go over to the browser, and you can see here argument 1 passed to add must be of the type array, but an integer was given. So this is pretty useful because it means that if you are definitely accepting an array, you can actually protect against anything else being typed in, and it will give you a more friendly error message here. So now that we have an array of numbers, obviously when we invoke or call this function, we want to pass in that array up there that we've already created. So just to keep things simple, let's bring this down here. Okay, so now we need to basically create any variable, it really doesn't matter, but basically just something to keep track of the total. Now obviously to start with, before we start iterating through the numbers, this is going to be 0. So now what we want to do is, using what we know about for each loops, we can go through these numbers, so for each numbers as number, and then onto that total we can add each number. So total, and we can either say total equals total plus number, remember, or just to keep things nice and simple, we can say plus equals. It's a little bit cleaner. And then down here, once we finish looping, we can return that total. So now what we should get is the same result, but things are a lot more flexible. If we wanted to add up more numbers, we just add them onto the array and it just works. And of course, you can also pass this array directly into this as well, like so, without having to declare a variable. So we get exactly the same result. Now this solution works perfectly. However, there's a much easier way if you literally just wanted to take a list of numbers, add them up, and that's where we're going to talk about the Func Get args function. So let's go ahead and get rid of all of this and just start again and see how we might do this. So Func Get args is a predefined PHP function that when used inside of a function will give us an array of all of the arguments that have been passed in. Now this might seem a little bit weird, but what we're going to do is we're going to define out this add function with no arguments at all. And then inside of here, we're going to do a var dump on Func Get args, because remember var dump will output that to the page. So let's go ahead and echo out add and then just see what we get. So let's refresh and you can see we get an empty array. So this Func Get args function is returning an array to us, which we're just dumping to the page at the moment. Now, if we were to define, but not in an array, a list of numbers, so before we had 5, 10, and 10, what's now going to happen is, despite the fact that we haven't provided in the options or arguments that we're expecting, this will pick them up anyway using this Func Get args function. So if we refresh, you can see now we have 3 items in here. We have 5, 10, and 10. So using this then, rather than directly passing an array in, what we can do is just do a for each over Func Get args, and it makes the function usable like this, rather than having to pass an array in. Now, I'm not saying that this is the best solution, but Func Get args can be very, very useful depending on what you're doing. So at least you know it's there now. So let's go ahead and recreate this. We're going to say total equals 0. And again, we're going to do a for each loop, because remember, Func Get args returns a array. So we're going to say for each Func Get args as number. In here, we're going to say total plus equals number. And then down here, we're going to do the same thing, because of course we want to return that total. So once again, we get exactly the same result. Now, if you wanted to kind of protect against this, what you could do is inside of here, create an if statement. Remember, we can go ahead and continue or break inside of a for each loop. So you might want to say if not, and we're going to use another built-in function called isInt, and then say number. Now you can also use isNumeric as well, which might make a little bit more sense. So if the number within the arguments we've given is not numeric, then maybe we want to continue and not add it on. So for now, let's just get rid of this and see what happens when we pass in a value that we shouldn't really be passing in. So let's pass that in and refresh. Notice we don't get any difference, but remember, PHP is typecasting these values. If I were to say 1 Alex, that will be cast to an integer when it's added, and you can see it's added onto the total. So things like this can get a bit confusing, but just for the sake of clarity, if it's a string, we want to ignore it, and that's where that check that I just added in there comes in. So if it's not numeric, so if any of these options that are passed in or arguments that are passed in are not numeric, we want to continue the loop. So now you'll notice we only get 25 because this is not a number. So hopefully that makes sense. There's still quite a lot of code here though, so we can literally shorten this down even further to just one line within this function. And let's get rid of all of this and look at how we might do that. So there is another built-in PHP function called array_sum. Now what this will do is it will add up any values within an array. So just to test this out, I'm going to go ahead and comment this line out, and I'm going to echo the result of array_sum, and I'm going to pass in 5, 10, and 10 just in an array to that function. So let's go ahead and refresh, and you can see we get the same result. So by doing this and combining that with Func Get args, we can actually in one line return up a total of any amount of arguments we've passed in. So inside of the function then, we would simply return array_sum, and we would go ahead and pass in Func Get args, which we know is an array, like so, and then we're done. That is pretty much how easy it's going to be. So now let's bring back using this add function, 5, 10, and 10, we know is 25, we get exactly the same result. So really, the lesson from this example is that writing code is sometimes about finding better ways to do things by using what we already have available to us. Now, it's not always possible to memorize every single PHP function, but just by having a look around the PHP documentation or having a look around online, you'll often find better ways to do things. Now, this isn't always the case with everything. Sometimes writing a little bit more code to make what you're writing easier to understand is better. But in this case, this is perfectly acceptable, and it's a lot shorter and a lot cleaner. So you now know how to grab a list of arguments that are passed in. If your function that you're building doesn't require potentially an unlimited amount of arguments like this one, then there's no real need to use Func Get args. It's always better to define out what you're doing in here. And actually the example we looked at earlier where we passed in an array of numbers actually makes a little bit more sense. If someone else was looking at your code and they saw this, they know that they have to pass an array of numbers in to be added up. So I'd recommend this solution personally. So there we go, a couple of practical examples, and we've learned quite a bit from this lesson.